Firstly, I can report that we have had 3 new cases of COVID-19 overnight. That is now 9 new cases in the last 2 days. Like yesterday's cases, the new cases are all returned Australian travellers who flew into Perth recently from overseas. 2 of these cases are interstate residents who travelled from Indonesia, and the third is a West Australian who was on a flight from Doha. Contact tracing is underway on both these flights to identify close contacts of the newly diagnosed cases. It's important to note that all these passengers are also in hotel quarantine. The state's total number of cases now sits at 621. There are now 12 active cases in Western Australia, 10 West Australians and 2 from interstate. All are in hotel quarantine. As everyone can see, the situation around the world and in Victoria continues to evolve. Case numbers in some countries are at unbelievable levels. Our friends in Victoria are in an extremely serious situation. Suburban lockdowns, even specific residential building lockdowns. Things I don't want to have to consider here in Western Australia. The level of community spread inside Victoria is something that we haven't seen before in this country. There is no doubt about it. As a nation, we are entering a new and dangerous phase of this pandemic. Victoria is doing all it can to bring the situation under control. I'm pleased to hear common sense has prevailed and the border between Victoria and New South Wales will now close. I think that is a smart and correct decision. And I think it has been long overdue. Western Australia is here to help where we can. We've sent over one of our best public health professionals, and we have a team of people working from Perth helping with contact tracing in Victoria. As a state, we are in this fortunate position to help, but we cannot take anything for granted. We are now in day 10 of phase 4 of our roadmap for Western Australia. Western Australians have been enjoying a new level of normality in recent weeks. Our economy is recovering and people are returning to work. I don't want to see all of our hard work go to waste. That's why it is so important that as a community, we work together and continue to listen to the health advice. COVID-19 is not going away anytime soon. And even though we have our hard borders in place, any day the virus could slip through the cracks without us knowing. On Friday, the Police Commissioner joined me out at Eucla on the border with South Australia. At that checkpoint, we have dedicated West Australians working night and day to manage our borders. I can't thank them enough for the important work that they are doing. Private vehicles are down to a trickle across that border, but essential freight continues to ensure our state continues to operate and live freely, and we have essential supplies. However, it appears as Western Australia continues to lead the country and position itself as a safe haven from COVID-19, new arrivals into Western Australia have started to rise. In recent days, we've seen an uptick in air arrivals into Perth Airport, both domestic and international arrivals. Generally speaking, on average, the amount of arrivals is more than 98% down on what it would have been, or what we saw pre-pandemic. That's a 98% plus reduction in air arrivals into Western Australia. However, just the smallest increase in arrivals now needs to be taken seriously. For example, yesterday, 3 international flights and 3 domestic flights landed in Perth. The increase in arrivals does put pressure on how we manage our border controls and our quarantine systems. At this point, we don't appear to be receiving redirected international flights from Melbourne. However, Perth is the western gateway to Australia, and over the last week we have seen a slow increase in arrivals into Perth. We're not at the level we were back in March or April, however, it is a noticeable increase. The reality is Perth and WA are the envy of the world. For those West Australians that have been stuck overseas for whatever reason, The desire to come home is now obviously stronger than ever. Currently, we have more than 1,100 people in hotel quarantine across 5 hotels in Perth, plus a large number of people who have been directed to self-quarantine at home, who have mostly arrived from interstate. Our hotel quarantine systems have been sound, with expert clinical staff overseeing the arrangements in our hotels. However, if arrivals increase, our resources will start to be spread thinly. That's why the state government has now formally requested the federal government to put a cap on international arrivals into Perth Airport. Consistent with the federal government's support for the New South Wales cap, I've asked the Prime Minister to agree on a cap for Western Australia, something in the vicinity of 1 flight per 3 days. We need to slow the flow of arrivals into Western Australia. This will help us manage the arrivals and quarantine arrangements to the highest possible standard. In addition, Cabinet today approved the drafting of urgent legislation that will force any returning traveller, West Australian or not, to pay for their 14 days of hotel quarantine. This legislation will be drafted as quickly as possible. Parliament isn't due to return until mid-August, Parliament isn't due to return until mid-August though. So once the bill is ready and approved, we will recall Parliament, if necessary, for a special sitting to get this legislation through quickly. Our police force are doing an excellent job policing the border and are running regular spot checks on people who are directed to self-quarantine. But we need to stay on top of the situation and do everything we can to reduce the risk of COVID getting into the community. WA has not recorded a community-based infection since the 11th of April. That was 86 days ago. Clearly, our hard border with the East has served us well, but our hard border is under threat. As we know, Clive Palmer's High Court challenge is being supported by the federal government. The announcement today between New South Wales and Victoria to close their borders is one that I support. But the idea our hard border is being challenged in the High Court is now clearly flawed and completely unnecessary. The High Court challenge consumes the resources of many of our top public servants, from our Solicitor General, our Chief Health Officer, and our Police Commissioner. In light of the New South Wales-Victoria border closure today, I have asked the Prime Minister to formally withdraw their support from Clive Palmer's High Court challenge. It does not make sense for the federal government to be supporting a border closure between New South Wales and Victoria, but on the other hand, challenging West Australians' border in the High Court of Australia. Quite frankly, the legal challenge, and especially the Commonwealth's involvement in it, has now become completely ridiculous. This nonsense has to stop, and it has to stop now. Western Australia's island within an island strategy has been an integral part of our success. As a result, WA is the most economically free and active state in Australia due to our relaxed restrictions. But we cannot get complacent. I cannot thank the West Australian community enough for everything they have done over the last 4 months. We need to remain vigilant. That means don't go to work if you're sick. Don't go out or visit friends and family if you're unwell. It's just not worth it. Maintain a physical distance between others where possible. Cough or sneeze into your elbow. Wash your hands properly. As Western Australians, we all have a personal responsibility. The more we follow the health advice, the more chance we have of being able to continue our roadmap to recovery. Any questions?
Do you feel vindication today? Obviously the New South Wales Premier has given you a hard time for a long time about reopening WA's border. If it was up to her, it would have been open months ago, and now today she announces that she's closing her border with Victoria. So do you feel vindication today?
Look, it's not about that. It's about doing the right thing by the people of the state. And we've tried to do the right thing by the people of Western Australia the whole way along. I've expressed that nationally, I've expressed that at National Cabinet. I've advised all the other premiers, the Prime Minister, that we need to keep our border in place until it's safe to bring it down. Now, obviously that's copped some criticism, but I think the cautious, considered, careful approach has paid dividends for our state, and we intend to keep doing that. The best thing that could happen now is Mr Palmer withdraw his High Court challenge and the Commonwealth stop supporting it. That's, can I just finish?
Yeah.
The best thing that could happen is Mr Palmer withdraw his High Court challenge and the Commonwealth withdraw their support for it. Clearly there is no basis to this High Court challenge now, especially the Commonwealth. So I've written to the Prime Minister today, I've contacted him personally to indicate I would think it's appropriate now they withdraw this legal action.
The Berejiklian was very keen to enforce the need or speak to the need for this border to close. They're even getting soldiers down there. In that same press conference, she then called for other states to drop their borders. But because we then have Victoria contained, we're able to, other states are able to sort of move freely amongst themselves. What do you make of that?
I didn't know that. Obviously I've been in a cabinet meeting, but I think premiers should be able to make the decision in the interests of their own state without others trying to tell them what to do. And that's what we are doing. We are keeping Western Australia as safe as we possibly can in this dire situation. And at this point in time, we've had now 86 days without a case of community infection. And the border arrangement has been a big part of that.
Will essential workers from Victoria continue to receive exemptions to come to WA?
Well, we obviously have an exemption process, and we allow some people through on the basis that we need trucks to deliver food. A lot of our food actually comes out of Victoria. We need important supplies for the mining industry. A lot of that comes out of New South Wales and Victoria. So people have to drive those trucks. People have to come in for those purposes. But we are reviewing the exemption categories to make sure it's as strict and tight as possible, while still at the same time allowing for essential people to come in. It's not ideal. It's not ideal. But it's tougher and more restrictive than any other state or territory in the country.
Congratulations on the 14 days. At least 2 flights coming in from Melbourne. Are you confident around the...
I did miss the start of your question, Eliza.
I think there's at least 2 flights coming in from Melbourne, for example, just today. Are you confident around measures to protect Western Australia from those flies?
Yes, if there's police at the airport, they review every single person who comes through to make sure that only those people who have an exemption can come into our state. And that's the strictest and most comprehensive controls of any state in Australia. But clearly, we're going to double down and make sure that no one is coming in who doesn't meet the strict criteria of an exemption.
What are the criteria or the protocols around somebody like a truck driver that comes from Victoria? When they arrive here, is there any kind of quarantine period for them, or can they move freely within Perth or WA?
No, there's directions that are issued by the Police Commissioner. And so what they do is they set out those people who are exempt. But there's also protocols, and that is that those people are not to mix unnecessarily with West Australians. If you're a truck driver, you're meant to do your business and then go back home. Clearly we need food. I was at the border the other day. There's important supplies for mining companies. For instance, there was a whole bunch of conveyor belts on the back of trucks that are necessary for mines to operate that were coming through. These are the sorts of things you need to continue to have happen, or else we'll lose industry and we'll run out of food. So I think people understand that, but there's protocols around the people when they come into Western Australia. Obviously, our expectation is they adhere to it. We can't put a police officer on every single person that comes into the state, but anyone who is not exempt is not allowed in. Many of the people who are exempt are required to quarantine, and some people, those who are driving trucks or what have you, are permitted to go about their business, but there is protocols around them that indicate they shouldn't be mixing with others, and there's obviously a lot of enforcement, especially by companies and employers to make sure that their people are doing the right thing.
The new legislation with the 14-day quarantine that travellers will have to pay for, are you concerned that more people will start requesting to quarantine at home and therefore they could end up breaking the rules because they're not as tightly monitored as they would be in a hotel room?
Well, these are for people who come in from overseas overwhelmingly. And the overwhelming majority quarantine from overseas, quarantine in hotels. Sometimes if they've got a specific medical condition or whatever it might be, they are permitted to quarantine at home. Our expectation is that will continue, that our hotels will continue to be quarantine centres for people from overseas. Clearly, one of the major threat vectors is people from overseas. That's the major problem. As I said, the 9 cases in the last 2 days have all been people who come back from Europe or the Middle East or from Indonesia. So making sure those people are in hotel quarantine, which they are, is very important, and that will continue.
Andrew Miller, the AMA chief, is saying that he's reported in the West Online this morning that he feels vaguely nauseous at the prospect of 60,000 people at Optus Stadium as a result of Phase 5, and also has called for the AFL hubs to be reconsidered. Has this changed your mind about Phase 5 and its implementation?
Well, Phase 5 is due to come in on July 18, and that's the removal of all restrictions bar the interstate border, the international border, and the controls over remote Aboriginal communities. We always said with Phase 5 that we would continually review that based upon health advice, and that review is currently ongoing. We will make a final decision on that over the course, I expect, of the coming week, as to whether or not we go to Phase 5 on July 18 or whether or not we delay that beyond that date. Now, we don't have any evidence of community spread in Western Australia. We had our last case more than 80 days ago, but obviously in the Victorian situation means we are currently reviewing the The Victorian situation means we're currently reviewing whether or not to go to Phase 5 on July 18, and we'll make a decision on that over the coming week.
If Victoria is going to be cut off from other states and territories, if Victoria is going to be cut off from other states and territories, and people aren't coming and going from Victoria to other states and territories, is there not any merit in reopening WA's border now?
No, we're keeping a clearly understood, easily enforced regime in place for Western Australia until such time as it's right to bring it down.
The AMA has called for those further restrictions to be eased at this point. So it's
sorry, which restriction?
The AMA, or restrictions in general. They've said across the nation it's time for COVID restrictions to stop being eased. That was a call.
Stop being eased.
Yeah,
okay.
A national call, and the AMA agrees with that. It sounds like that could be on the cards and is being considered in terms of Phase 5.
Well, that's right. What I said was Phase 5 was due to come in on July 18. We'll review that over the coming week as to whether or not that's appropriate. We always said we'd do that, and so that's what we'll currently consider.
Essential workers arriving from interstate, is that the thing that you're most concerned about now? It seems like a substantial weakness in the state's hot border.
Well, my biggest concern is actually people coming from overseas. And the numbers and the pressure that puts on our hotels and our security arrangements. That's why I've written to the Prime Minister to ask that we have a cap on the number of flights coming into Western Australia from overseas. New South Wales has done it. That's the other major gateway city of Australia. And you've got to understand, because I think a lot of people don't, these are Australians returning home. So what we're saying is we need to slow down the flow of Australians returning home from overseas. They've actually had 4 or 5 months to get home. We need to slow down the flow so we can manage it appropriately in this situation. We're finding increasingly people coming back from overseas are positive, and that puts pressure on our quarantine services, our hotels, our security services, and potentially our hospitals. So slowing down that flow from overseas is very important. In terms of our interstate border, the biggest threat to that is Clive Palmer and the federal government. That's the biggest threat. If they succeed in the High Court, well, then we'd have to bring it down. We'd have no protection. So all I'd say to the Prime Minister and everyone else across Australia, stop the legal action. Let us do our job. Let us protect our citizens as best we can.
Sorry,
Alex?
another issue.
Yeah.
Thank you. Look, there was a horrible tragedy up in Broome over the weekend. There's a community mourning. Do you have a message to that community?
Oh, terribly tragic. He was obviously a very prominent Kimberley identity, and the loss of a little girl is shocking. I feel deepest sympathy for the people, his family and friends, and for the people of the Kimberley.
Secondly, a question on Collingwood. We've heard today that they've travelled without Jordan DeGoey. He's facing indecent assault charges. Do you have any concerns about him coming to Western Australia? We're hearing that he might fly directly into Western Australia.
I don't know the situation. Whatever he does, he'll be subject to the same quarantine and safety arrangements as the other members of the team.
Is there any consideration being put to requiring everyone to self-quarantine or to quarantine in a hotel, especially once you get this legislation passed that they have to pay for?
It's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to do because of the hotel capacity and the fact that many are West Australians who have homes that they go to, but they are monitored very closely by our police, and that's an ongoing process.
Just on that.
But most of it, the overwhelming majority of the international people are far more likely to have the virus. They quarantine in hotels with a few exceptions, particularly in the case of medical situations or compassionate grounds, where people may be permitted to go home and quarantine. For instance, there are cases out there of people who come back from overseas because their spouse or their child or their parent has died, and they've been given an exemption to go home on the basis that they need to support their family, but they have to quarantine at home.
Can you give some clarity to, in the respect of Victorian teams, if they hard quarantine in Queensland, are they then required to quarantine again in Western Australia if they come over here to play?
I would have thought so. This is a matter the Police Commissioner is managing, but you quarantine. But the football teams quarantine for 14 days, and they've got a testing regime as part of that. So the Police Commissioner manages that. That question exactly has not been posed to me, but I would have thought they quarantine when they get here.
So a month, they would have to hard quarantine for a month?
Personally, if football wants to have their season, they need to abide by the rules. And the rules are there to protect us all. And they're not exempt. They need to adhere to the rules. If there's complaints about the fact that they can't bring family members or their dogs or their family members or their girlfriends or wives or whatever it might be, well then they just need to roll with it. A lot of people in the broader community are rolling with extreme circumstances. People working in mining or small business or defence, they're putting up with a lot. I met a group of police officers out on the border the other day, and public servants working out there in the middle of the desert. People are putting up with a lot at the moment. Football players can put up with a little bit as well.
Is Bill McGowan dreaming if he thinks the AFL Grand Final will be in Victoria?
I don't know the answer to that because the AFL Grand Final is obviously a long way away. Anything can happen in the meantime, but we've said to the AFL publicly, if they want to hold the Grand Final here, we're a good location, but they need to meet the safety requirements as directed by the Chief Health Officer.
And in respect of, still on COVID, Indonesia apparently has said that travel to Bali will be open again in September. I think it's about September the 12th, which is a little way off. Do you see that as realistic?
No. Our border controls internationally means Australians can't go. And if Australians do find a way of getting there, my view would be we don't let them back in. They shouldn't be doing this. Going overseas at this point in time, unless it's an extreme situation, you shouldn't be doing.
So any developments with WA providing any sort of support in terms of medical supplies and staff to Victoria, as some other states have?
We have made the offer and provided contact tracing support. Professor Taran Manthri has gone over to support Victoria, and we continue to work with the Victorian government on what else we can do. Obviously, it's a little bit trickier for Western Australia because if we send some of our people over there, well, then they'd have to quarantine for 14 days when they get home, and we may need them. So it's a bit trickier, so we're providing what support we can, particularly if it's people based here who can do contact tracing.
Premier, just back on footy, if you are going to review, or you are reviewing stage 5, is there a chance we might not get a full crowd for the derby or footy?
Yeah, well, clearly we're reviewing it. We always said we would. As we head towards phase 5, we said we would review it. That may have consequences for the AFL or for other things in our community. But frankly, health comes first, AFL comes a distant second, and we'll do the right thing by the people of the state.
Could those consequences include banning Victorian teams from coming to a hub in WA, or is that not a...
No, I don't think so, because look, we're allowing for quarantine arrangements for people who come here for work purposes, and that's what the AFL is, and we've worked through the arrangements around that. As to the crowd of the game, that's something we will continue to review over the coming week as to whether or not we would allow a full crowd or stay with the existing phase 4 arrangements, which would be a half crowd. So that's something we'll monitor as the week goes on. Obviously the whole country is in a very serious situation. The one thing I'd say about the rest of the states and what's going on over east, it's very tragic, it's very serious, but they're jumping here, there and everywhere in terms of their border arrangements. We've just had a very simple, straightforward arrangement that everyone should understand, and it stood us in good stead, and I'd urge the Commonwealth to stop challenging it in the High Court.
Just back on the legislation around the hotel quarantine, that's not retrospective, it's just from after the... It would
be, well, we'll see, but we will bring it in as soon as we can, but we'll look at whether or not we can backdate it to some point perhaps from now when I announce it, but that's something we'll consider.
Have you received any legal advice when it comes
Sorry,
just in
for
line with
Eliza.
issues being seen in the high density units in Victoria, is it something that the WA government is reviewing if there would be a potential outbreak that we could see in the state? Is it something that Cabinet's discussed or reviewed?
No, well, we haven't had that, but obviously all of our plans have now refined. So rather than shutting everything, if there's an outbreak, you look to localised control, localised shutdowns if there's an outbreak. Obviously if the outbreak is widespread, well then you do widespread shutdowns. That's something we've worked through over the last 4 months, and obviously our practices and our procedures and our protocols are far better than they were. So no, we haven't directly, as far as I'm aware, done an exercise around a specific building, but clearly the Victorian experience is something we would take into account as a model were that to occur here.
So have
you got any legal advice as to what are the chances of Clive Palmer's legal charge? How much percentage of success he's going to get if he goes ahead in the High Court?
Well, our advice is that our case is strong. Our case is strong. But obviously our State Solicitor, our Solicitor General, our Police Commissioner, our Chief Health Officer and numerous lawyers and other officials are tied up in this. And it'd be far better use of their time dealing with COVID rather than worrying about Clive Palmer's travel plans and the Commonwealth's fine constitutional points. I'd much prefer we worry about the main issue rather than this ridiculous challenge.
It's questionably hypocritical, isn't it? How do you authorise or approve, as in the Prime Minister's done, closure of Victoria and New South Wales state border and put police on there, and put soldiers on there to do it, and then argue for the border at South Australia to be lifted?
It's patently ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. They should stop, and they should withdraw their support from Mr Palmer. I mean, the case is now gone. The case has just disappeared into thin air, and they should let it go and stop supporting Mr Palmer. Mr Palmer is doing what he does for whatever reason. The Commonwealth Government should not be too close to him.
So what is the criteria for reopening the WA border if Victoria is blocked off to the rest of the country, and that's where your concern is the community transmission there? What is the criteria then for reopening?
When we get advice from the Chief Health Officer, that's when we'll do it. But I just want to repeat, every other state appears to have jumped around in terms of their border arrangement. We haven't. We've just had a straightforward, reasonable, sensible arrangement, and that's what's going to continue.
You said there was a rise in arrivals to international and domestic flights. How much of a threat is this to WA, and are you concerned that we could see a second wave?
Well, clearly we're getting more international flights in here. Melbourne has closed themselves to international arrivals. Sydney has put a cap on their international arrivals. Certainly the second one appears to have lifted the number of flights coming in here. That's obviously a threat to our state, and we'd like to see a cap put on it. If Australians haven't got home before now, basically they've made their own decisions. And what we are saying to the Commonwealth Government is we want a cap on the number of international flights coming into Perth exactly the same as Sydney has. The Commonwealth has authorised it for Sydney. They should do the same for the other major gateway city of Australia, which is Perth.
You can say that now there's talks of the legislation being brought in for people to pay for the hotel quarantine, that we might see a big influx in people coming home all of a sudden?
Sorry, I couldn't understand your question, Megan.
So but you've now said that there's going to be legislation for people to pay for their own hotel quarantine. Between now and August, are you concerned that there's going to be a big influx of people coming in because they want to avoid having to spend that money?
That is a good point. That's why the Commonwealth needs to put a cap on the number of flights coming into Perth, because we don't want to see a rapid inflow that we then have to deal with that puts pressure on our quarantine system. Thanks very much.
Thank you.